We are Siman Pei-Dal, we're starting Halacha test. Okay, the Mechaber says, if you cook the food within 12 months, meaning when the bugs are in there are still also below bedika without checking it first, so you did the wrong thing. The last Halacha said you're supposed to check the food before you eat it, and now you did it. You messed up. You cooked it. If you could still check now, so buy it. So going fine. So that's no problem. So check it now. If you're not able to, you're not able to check it anymore, mutter, then the food is going to be mutter. And then Mechaber finishes off this part. He says, if you find some leftovers and some bugs on the side, then you should throw them out. Okay. So we're really not actually going to talk about the part of what the Mechaber said so far. Probably get to that at a different time. Probably not next time, maybe the time after that. But for now, we have to talk about some things really to get into this halacha in the first place. And that is, the last halacha mentioned something. It said that if something is commonly infested, then you have to check it. You have to check the bug. And our halacha got into a little more of the details. And in our halachas, the place can sort of talk about what that term common means. We say that if something commonly has bugs in it, then you have to check it. Okay, what does that mean? Common. Okay, and what they take it, that it brought in our halacha, that's what we're talking about here, they connect our halachas to Hilchos Teraifos. Okay, the rules that we have for here, for what we check, is connected to Hilchos Teraifos, which is, there are many ways an animal can become sheifa. There are many ways that can happen, but Lamaisa, we only check the animal's lungs, we don't check the whole animal. Why is that? We only check, why do we only check the animal's lungs? And not everything else. So there's a few different answers to that question. Why in Hilchos Teraifos don't we check everything in the animal? And the most widely accepted, well, basically, is what the Rashba says. It's at the beginning of Chulun. The Rashba says, he starts as follows. He says, roiv animals are not treifos. Roiv types of treifos don't occur, and therefore, mid-daraisa, you'd be allowed to eat the animal without checking it at all. You'd say, you follow the roiv, and you'd say most animals are not treifos, so you're allowed to eat it. However, Chazal made a requirement with Rabbanan that you have to check the animal to see if it's a treif. Okay, and the Rashba says that there's two reasons why that takana only applies to checking the lungs and not anything else. That's what the Rashba says. The Rashba and all the Rishonim say that the minig is to check only lungs, and he's explaining what the reason. He's going to give two reasons. The first one is what you probably would have guessed I'm going to say, which is that the lungs, when it starts in, have a Miut Hamatsui. The lungs are the kind of treifos that happen most commonly. It's a common minority. It happens often enough, and therefore that's what Chazal said you mechuyev to check for that thing. Other treifos that are other far-fetched, something could be wrong with its heart, with its brain. Those things are very rare, and therefore Chazal didn't require you to check this. Again, midrash you don't have to check any of these things, but midrabanan mechuyev to check these ones that are more common. Tur and Siman Lam Tes seems to bring this reason. That's what he seems to say is the main reason. And what would happen then, according to this reason? What happens if the metzius changes? Then you might have to check different parts of the animal. In other words, there's nothing magical about lungs. It has to do with what's more common. So, for example, 2 years ago, in 2009, they started noticing that they were shechting chickens. They started noticing that there was a problem of treifos in the thermos agidin. Okay, what the treifos was is really not so important to us, but they started noticing that it became very common. So they started checking animals. They started checking chickens because there was this problem that they were having. So, in other words, there wasn't anything magical about lungs. It's what's common. So, as soon as the Gideon started having a problem, they watched it. What, if you want to the end of the story, was that they eventually figured out why it was happening. It was strange. It was all of a sudden, there was a flare-up. They eventually figured out what happened. And once they fixed the problem, there were no more problems, and they stopped having to check them.
They check each one, or they just check samples?
No, I think they just check everyone. I don't remember the details. But they started checking because it was a problem. And they noticed that it was becoming matzui. If it came up, they didn't even check. In fact, in Eretz Yisrael, they always check chickens for tzom segidim. They have problems with the tzom segidim all the time. Okay, so in other words, there's nothing magical about lungs, according to this reason of the Rashba. It's just which ones are matzui and which ones are not. Okay, the other reason the Rashba says is that he says I'm not a shaykhit, but he says when you shecht an animal and you then cut it open to then use the animal, he says if you wouldn't look at the lungs to see if the animal's a treifa, he says it's looked like you don't even care about treifas. He says his words are, he says nira kamalam eina min ha'isr. It's as if you don't care. It's so easy. The lungs are right there in front of you. You have to cut the animal open anyhow. Why wouldn't you check it? Some say, then there's a whole thing, and you have to slice it open, and it's complicated, and check the animal's brains. Who looks in these places? But this is such an easy thing to check. If you wouldn't look at it, it looks like you're callous, like you don't care about the din, and therefore Chazal said you have to check it, not because it's a common treifos, but because it's an easy treifos to check. Okay, we'll see in Mitzvah next time, the Pri Megadim in Hamates and the Mechas Yaakov both seem to make it as if this is the ikar reason. And for that reason, Ramosha says that if you have, when you're cutting open chickens, I don't know if this is what they do at the slaughterhouses, but when you cut open chickens, a yid, that means a yid who knows what he's doing, needs to be the one to cut open the chicken, because even though we don't check lungs of chickens, but even so, you want a yid to cut it open, because if there'd be something grossly wrong with the animal, that would be a shiloh of treifos, at least someone who opens it up should have some idea that would notice that there's a problem. He says, don't have the guy open it up. Because in other words, the Rashba says, the reason why you check for treifos is it's so easy. Why not just look inside and just look at the lungs? What's the big deal? It's like as if you don't care about it. So therefore, if there's any reason, that any other way, the other thing that would make it easy, so in other words, who's going to cut open the chickens? A yid should do it, Moshe says, and you shouldn't have a guy do that. Okay, so
according to the second reason, what's the makar of the key of the check for all Miut Hamatsui things?
According to the second reason, there's no such rule as Miut Hamatsui. It has nothing to do with matzui and not matzui. It has to do with easy and hard.
And like you have to check vegetable. I mean, all the
so that according to that reason, if that would be the reason, if that would be the only reason, I don't know that these are arguing with each other. If this would be the only reason, then you would check vegetables that would be easy. In other words, you say if I could just pick it up and look it over, so why shouldn't I do that? It's as if I don't care that there might be bugs in there. If I'm just eating things without looking, I don't care. But that's because checking a vegetable would be, according to this, would be considered easy. Or I'd be mechuyev to check when it's considered easy.
There's a chumrah that you would have to check.
We certainly don't.
Right, and it would be a chumrah. It would be a chumrah.
Let's check carrots. You have to check like anything because.
Right, because hey, why not? Why not look at it? Okay, I mean the truth is, you probably know. Chayadim says, I think it's Chayadim. He says it's a good practice that I do all the time. Before I eat any food, I look to see if there are any bugs in it. He says, and you don't know how many times I was saved from eating Isser by doing that. Okay, so, no. Look, he's reflecting this point, which is.
It's a whole different set of rules.
It's a completely different way of looking at it right now. As we see by our halachos, okay, everyone uses the word says me. I say, well, if you wait in Miut Hashem next time, we're going to see a possible application to this. Okay, I'm just okay. Anyhow, so but in Miut Hashem, that'll be for next time. I'm bringing the Rashba, and everyone connects out into Hilchos Treifos. Said the reason why you check certain vegetables has to do with Hilchos Treifos, and these are the two big reasons that are given over there. So because of this, we say if there's what Yossi is saying, basically following the first reason, if there's a Miut Hamatsui, then we check it. And the second thing is, which is what our halacha was, is what happens if you cooked it without checking? What happens if you forgot to check? Okay, well, what's the din in Hilchos Treifos? If you forgot to check, we're not going to Hilchos Treifos, but there are situations in Hilchos Treifos that if you forgot to check if the animal's a treifa, and you can't check it anymore, on the circumstances, the animal's not there. You're allowed to eat that animal. So, same thing, that's exactly what the Mechaber said by us. If the person forgot to check, under certain circumstances, if he forgot to check, he's allowed to eat the vegetable anyhow. He cooked the vegetable, it's too late to check, under certain circumstances he could eat, and in fact, much of our discussion about this halacha will be about that. People trying to apply that case. When is it that I'm allowed to eat it, even though I didn't check it? Meaning, remember, midaraisa, I'm not going to check at all. It's a chiyuv d'Rabbanan. Well, it's only chiyuv d'Rabbanan in certain cases. And the fact that it's a chiyuv d'Rabbanan means if I forgot to check, I'm not able to check, I might be allowed to eat it anyhow. That's what's going to be lots of our discussion later on. Not for today or next time, but for later on, of the possible ways to apply that to Lamaisa to be able to eat foods under certain circumstances. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is, what does that mean? I told you that where this term came from, and the Mechaber actually mentioned in the last halacha that there's such a thing called the Miut Hamatsui. Well, what does that mean? Okay, so we're not going to get into very gory details, but we're going to see that there are three different sets of arguments as to how to define this thing called Miut Hamatsui. Okay, before we go on, I just have to tell you, it's sort of going to get to the end of halacha that there's another. I don't know what the word is. Another level. Okay, we have this thing called Miut Hamatsui. If it's a Miut Hamatsui, you have to check it. But there's something called Miut Hamatsui, it's so rare, you don't have to check it. In the case, you have a carrot, no one ever finds bugs in carrots, you don't have to check it. That's Miut Hamatsui. We're going to see later, there's a higher category called Muchsik B'Tolim, that it's very, very common to have bugs in it. In that case, it's Mechuyev Midaraisa to check. Okay, we're not talking about muchlik today. We're focusing on what the common vegetables are, which is miut hamatzui. Okay, there's three layers of argument about this thing. The first is, Rav Vosner says, the way you define miut hamatzui is, I'm saying the way Belsky explains it, is that the way you define miut hamatzui is, when someone finds a bug in that vegetable, is he surprised? When you find it, if you pick up a romaine lettuce and you find a bug in it, you're not surprised. You know, everybody knows that it happens every once in a while that you find a bug in romaine lettuce. That's you're not surprised. If you pick up an apple and you find a worm inside of it, it's a whole to-do. At least in America. What a strange thing that you found the worm in it. It's a surprise to the person. Okay, so you judge it by just to an average person. Does that seem typical or not typical? Is it within the range of regular things that happen that you do or don't have a bug in it?
There's no numbers.
Right, that's correct. That's where Rav Vosner holds. Rav Belsky holds a variation. Very much attaches a lot of merit to this. Rav Belsky a little bit holds of the other reasons, other things we can say, but he attaches a lot of merit to this point, which is you have to look at it. Is it you expect it or you don't expect it? Are you surprised or not surprised to find the bug?
Isn't the only reason you're expecting or not expecting is because everyone's telling us to expect or not expect? So, if you go to a guy and say, no, there's a lot of bugs in romaine lettuce, so don't be surprised. But if you go to a Jew and say,
okay, so you're right that it needs someone who has some experience. What I mean, so who's used to it because he's done it beforehand. What I mean is, if you never looked at a vegetable in your life, you can't say, I never saw any bugs in this vegetable, because of course not, because you never sat in the kitchen. Or if you say a guy who's not focusing in that way of looking for little bugs like that, you say, of course he's surprised because he doesn't know what he's looking at. But he'd also be surprised if he told him that if you put sugar into a pot, it could turn into caramel. He's like, what a surprise. Well, that's not surprise. That's just the way things are. So yes, the person needs to have a certain familiarity. But the person, if you check 10 heads of romaine lettuce, you would know that there are bugs in there. Well, not to you, that's not a surprise.
So this will be like more of a chumrah, no? It will be more than 10% probably. It will be like even like 5%.
Okay, it's interesting you should say. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. I'm going to get back to that in a second. Okay. Everybody knows that the Mishnah Yaakov doesn't agree to this. The Mishnah Yaakov came up with this idea that there's a mathematical way of determining if it's a miut hamatzui or not, and he says that there's a...
Who's this? Who's Mishnah?
The Mishnah Yaakov. Yaakov. Am I saying it right?
Etlinger?
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't remember who it is. Whoever it is. We'll look in the Svarim V'Seifrim and find out what it is. And he says that if it's more than 10% infested, then it's a miut hamatzui, and if it's less than 10%, it's not miut hamatzui. Okay, that's what he says. And he brings a raya from a Gemara that people agree or don't agree with his raya, but he brings a raya, and that's what he says. This is like a footnote to that is, within this idea that it could be 10%, there are those who quote Israeli poskim who say that it's even less than that, even 5 or 7.5% less than that. And the opposite extreme is that the Rivash says that it has to be karov l'mechza. Okay, so if he said everybody basically accepts this 10% number, but you should just know there are numbers on the opposite extremes also. Okay, the Rivash says it's basically half the time, and others say even less. Okay, but 10% is what people think, because that's our first machlokes. Should we use it just like sort of like a common understanding of, yes, I expect that, you don't expect it. And the second, and the other is this more formal, more mathematical way of looking at that is 10%. Okay, that's our first machlokes. Second is...
Back to the surprise thing, it's
yes.
very objective.
Very objective? It's subjective? Because?
It depends on the person.
Okay.
So are you going to make a call from it? Or are you going to... How are you going to do that?
How are you going to explain what it means to be surprised or not surprised?
Right.
Okay, that's a fair question. I suspect, and I'll say this later again, that we think of this because we're very modern and sophisticated, and we think of things like in percentages and have to be fit into 19 little categories. But that 100 years ago, that was what most people would have thought. Just like it is. We usually have it, but we don't usually have it. That would be a more logical, not from a modern perspective, from a more traditional perspective. We're more scientific. Good word. Okay. Second is, now that we say we should have 10%, okay, now we say we should have 10%. So how are we going to define this 10%? Okay, another famous machlokes. You picked the wrong week to come. Another famous machlokes. Okay, the Shlomo Zalman says, and others as well. Rabbi Asher says it. Rabbi Belsky says it. What should you do? How are you going to decide 10%? He says, if you have a head of cabbage, so if you have one bug in 10 heads of cabbage, so that's 10%. Okay, so if you had 10 heads of lettuce, and you had one bug in 10 heads, so that's 1 out of 10 have a bug in them, that's considered a Miut Hamatsui. Okay? Schachter and Rabbi Schwartz say, no, you don't go by the head of cabbage, you go by the servings of cabbage. So if 2 heads would serve 10 people, so we say 2 heads serve 10 people, there's 1 bug in 2 heads, then it's awesome. Okay? So that comes out kula. In this case, that's coming out to be a kula, because if let's say there'd be 1 bug in 5 heads, this second way of looking at it would say that's not a Miut Hamatsui. It's too rare. There's only 1 bug in every 25 servings. And the other way of looking at it would say if there's 1 bug in 5, that's way over 10%. That's 20%.
Is there a source of this machlokas, or just
no? So that's what I'm going to say to you later. No, none of this from this second and on is completely people's hashara, people's judgment as to how they think it should be. And you'll hear a little bit why they're making these judgments in a second. Now, the third machlokas is, if you want to say that it goes by the serving side, by servings, Rabbi Shepton says you look at those servings by each person, and not only by each person, but by the maximum that person would eat. Okay, so that means is what he says. The way we're judging a Miut Hamatsui is: are you likely to eat a bug? Is it 1 out of every times you can eat a bug? So if you like to eat 3 ounces of the food, so then for you, Miut Hamatsui is 1 in every 30 ounces. If I eat 5 ounces of the food, so then for me it's 1 every 50 ounces of the food. I said the other way around. I got that backwards. Okay, anyhow. So if I eat 5 ounces, right? So 1 in 50 ounces would be at a Miut Hamatsui. That's what he says.
Does anybody say it's every bite? You go to 10 bites?
Every bite? That I haven't heard yet. I'm sorry.
Logically, then why shouldn't that be the case?
Because
I'm done with the issa ahead there. What am I want to know what am I going to do before I do what? Before I eat every bite. Is this bite mutter or not? Okay. Am I allowed to bite into this and swallow? Why is it pounded into the serving? The child is not on the serving. The child is on the want to eat this bite. Okay.
So maybe next time I'll stick that third sheet in. That I never heard of. That's really.
I don't understand why logically.
You're saying a big Yossi. What you're saying is
a
kula. Yeah. Because it means is right. If I could eat 20 bites in 1 serving, and you say no problem, I could have 2 bugs in there, and I'm safe. You know.
That's right.
Okay. He's looking at it as like if I'm sitting down to eat, am I likely to get a bug? Or am I not likely to get a bug? So if in 10% I'm going to get a bug or not, that's what he's. Okay.
I mean, they have this question by Shabbos. That's the situation.
You're looking at produce right now. Other than you.
But it should be in you.
Why?
Because there is
what we're looking at servings is looking at me, not the produce. It's looking at me. Am I likely to get a bug? So the way to look at it is like I'm sitting down to eat supper. Am I likely to eat a bug? Am I not likely? So from 1 in 10 times, then I have to check, or I don't have to check. So he's saying, well, what do you mean? But I'm not sitting to eat supper. I'm sitting to eat. Here's my first spoon I'm eating, and here's my second spoon.
Let's look at Shabbos. Some of the Shabbos, you can do something with some situation or not, right? So you don't say, like coming here, right? You don't say, well, it's a psik ratio. Let's say I'm going to come for 10 minutes. You don't say, well, it's a psik ratio. After 10 minutes, you're going to pull out of here. You don't say that. You say, every brush is each one is a psik ratio or not.
Okay. Yes, go for it. So that's a big rule. Okay. And others say that when we're making the serving size idea, we go by an average serving size. Okay. We don't look at every time I eat and each person individually. We're not so subjective. We look at generally how do people eat this food. Okay. So now that I told you these 3 layers of disagreement, how you should do that. We have a whole pile of questions on this. If you're going to say, like some Zam said, we don't go by servings, we go by the item. Okay, we have a head of lettuce, so we say we go by the head of the lettuce. Okay, well, what do you do when you have a small food? What do you do when you have raspberries? So should we say it's 1 every 10 raspberries? That's what it is? Well, raspberries come, each cute little raspberry, one at a time. So we say 1 in 10 raspberries has to have a bug, otherwise it's okay? So you say, what about parsley? So you say only 1, parsley comes in like leaves, sprigs of parsley. Is that each one of them a thing? So they say, no. It's not by the piece. It's by the unit. Okay. Well, what's a unit? What's a unit? Well, a lettuce. Okay, that's 1 lettuce is 1 unit. Okay. What about blueberries? You can buy blueberries in a pint, or half a pint, or in a pound bag. Okay. So which one of those is the unit? Well, which one of them? You can say it's a unit of it. Well, what's a unit? Well, does it depend? So in Koltov, it is a Miut Hamatsui. But in 10, it's not a Miut Hamatsui because they sell it in different size packages. What is that?
You really say it's a unit how it's sold?
Yeah. How you group them together? Well, what does that mean? How you group them together?
That's what they say.
Yeah. Well, what does that mean even? Well, you have to find some way. How are we going to define it? We can say each piece of parsley is on its own, each blueberry is on its own. Well, you can't say each blueberry is on its own.
That's a problem.
It's a question. That's a question on them. Okay.
And our common measuring for buying things, pints usually. Things come in pints and stuff.
Well, they also come in half pint. Okay, well, strawberries come in pound, 1 pint, and 2 pints.
Okay, so you say different country, different place, but they sell different sizes.
Generally, you don't buy like 3 strawberries. You buy like a pint or 2 pints.
Well, so which one is it? You want 1 pint or 2 pints? Which one do you want? So, wait a second. Wait. Then the opposite question. What happens if something that comes huge? What happens if you buy cabbage? Okay, cabbage comes the cabbages are used to make sauerkraut, like 10 pounds a piece. Okay? So, does that mean is that if there's one bug in 100 pounds of sauerkraut, that means it's a Miut Hamatsui? You know how much is 100 pounds of sauerkraut? Okay? How about like this? Here's another one. How about if there's bugs in reservoirs? Okay? So that means if there's one bug in 10 reservoirs worth of water, then that water is a Miut Hamatsui? I mean, it's ridiculous. Right? If we take our unit...
That's why Yossi's suggestion is much better.
Go by the pipe. No. This is a question. This is a question on the ones who said that it goes by the item.
Right.
It said by the serving. Okay, so the other guy says, see? It goes by the servings. Okay, we have the same questions for the servings. Okay, my example is as follows. Basil. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Basil is used... I have 4 different foods that they use basil in. Pasta sauce, salad dressing, veggie burgers, and something called pasta pesto. Okay? Well, guess what? You use a different amount of basil in each one of those things. Okay? According to a cheshbon, whether the cheshbon is right is not important. I'm using it for illustrative purposes. Okay? They made a cheshbon of how many bugs there are in basil, and they figured out like this. And then they looked at how much basil goes into these foods. And I found like this. Well, there's 1 bug in every 80 servings of pasta sauce. But there's 1 bug in every 250 servings of salad dressing. And there's 1 bug in every 300 veggie burgers. Because you're so little. Wait a second. But there's more than 1 bug in every serving, more than every serving of pasta pesto, because the stuff is like buried in basil. Okay, well, so which one should you use? You want to say it goes by the servings. Okay, well, which basil do you want to use? A basil Miut Hamatsui is not. You say, oh my gosh, it's 1 in every 300 veggie burgers. Nah, it's not matzui. What if it's more than even 1 bug in every serving of pasta pesto? Okay, so which serving should we use? So you say, okay. So you say, we'll use it every time the serving starts to see. Whichever one I eat, that's what it depends on. Okay, so that would work if you're sitting in your house. You want to know, should I check my parsley? Should I not check my parsley? Depends what you're doing with it. What happens if you want to give hashgacha to it? Okay, so how are you going to give hashgacha? How can you decide if the food needs to be checked or doesn't need checked? How are you going to say? You say, look, most people eat an ounce of a certain food for every serving. Okay? So you say, there's only 1 bug in every 20 ounces. Fine, we can give hashgacha without checking it, because there's only 1 bug in every 20 ounces. Okay? What happens if you get some Meshugana who wakes up in the middle of the night, he's dying to eat this food, and he eats 5 ounces of the food? So you just served him treif, because for him, 1 bug in every 20 ounces is going to be an hamatzui. So what are you going to do with the guy? Okay? And then from a completely different angle, isn't it odd that aside from the Mishkan's Yaakov, and aside up until 20 years ago, none of the place can talk about this. No one describes what it means to be being hamatzui. Nobody that I know of. There's no description. In the past 20 years, there's a zillion people talked about it. But until 20 years ago, besides the Mishkan's Yaakov, there's no one giving these scientific, mathematical explanations for it. And we also, it's hard to even understand this. Is that what Chazal expects from us? We also should make multi-year studies through all different kinds of variables to determine which foods are Miut Hamatsui. And all of these questions, all of the ones that I'm saying to you, all very much point to what Rav Osner said. I have to tell you, all these point to Rav Osner that it isn't so mathematical, because when you start being so mathematical, we run into all these different kinds of problems, and that it's a much more intuitive approach. That there's some kind of intuitive understanding is, either you're surprised to see bugs, or you're not surprised to see bugs. Everybody knows that lettuce has bugs in it, and everybody knows that carrots don't have bugs in them. And I guess someplace in our mind we have some way of quantifying this way and that way, but it's not. It's not something we can make so easy and say 10% yes, not 10% not. And somehow it seems that all that points in the direction of what Rav Osner or Rav Belsky are saying, that there has to be a logical. But Rav Belsky is really a variation. Rav Belsky really likes 10%, but he says that 10% has to be tempered by some seichel. In other words, don't be so attached to 10% to the extent that you ignore the fact that sometimes things sound ridiculous.
I don't get it. It's not 10% at all. Why?
What?
I don't see it.
He's like in between. He sort of like goes with. In other words, he says that 10% is like a guide.
It's taking super.
No, it's not. It's not the super. It's like a guide. 10% gives you like a rough idea of how to decide whether it is or is not matzui. But when it gets to be absurd, then he ignores it. In other words, he has to use a certain amount of seichel when he. Okay, now I have to tell you, the good news is The good news, after I gave you all the bad news, the good news is, what I thought was bad news, the good news is that there's usually no machlokes. That's the truth. There's usually no practical difference between what this shita and that shita, and everybody basically knows what's Miut Hamatsui and what's not Miut Hamatsui. Okay? Everyone sort of gets it on their own, and everyone sort of agrees which things have to be checked and not checked. Okay? Everyone sort of, all these different opinions, there isn't so much of a difference between them. That's the truth. There is, however, one case where it came out to be practical nafkamina, and that was, maybe you're already getting understanding what I'm about to say, which was the copepods in New York. The copepods, the bugs in the water in New York, where in order for the bugs to be usher, we talked about way back when that in order to be usher, they need to have been, there were shilas about whether the bugs in the water in that situation were usher. That was way back in the beginning of the sinning. Then the shilah was whether the bugs are big enough to be usher. But there is another question. What if they are? They have to be common enough also for them to be usher. So even if there would be one bug once a year, you'd find the bug that was usher. That wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be Miut Hamatsui. So the one element of making the bugs usher is that they have to be matzui. They have to be common. So the people who discovered these bugs, or who were working with these bugs, had to prove and had to show that in fact it was Miut Hamatsui. Okay, and they made all kinds of calculations to show that in fact it was matzui. It was common enough to meet this qualification of being Miut Hamatsui. Okay, so there's two arguments to that. The first one is not negate what we were just saying. The first is what we call bait and switch, okay? Which is to say, they would say is, they'd show you a bug, and they'd say, see how big this bug is? See these bugs? See how big they are? These are the bugs that we're finding in the water. And you say, really? They say, yes. And you know what? We find that one bug in every X number of ounces. And the implication is that the bug that you're seeing in front of you, we're finding that size bug in that many ounces. And the statistics, if every 12 ounces of water there's bugs. There's a bug. Really? Every 12 ounces of water? Every cup and a half I drink has a bug? Yes. But the bug that you're being shown is not the bug that in every 12 ounces.
What do they took the biggest bug there is?
Right, because here's a cup full of huge bugs, collected from 500 ounces of water. But the statistics were not necessarily, no, that's what I'm saying, that were bait and switch. Because I show you the big one, but when I tell you my statistics, I'm not telling you that the statistics were not based on...
I'm sure they'll tell you. We're showing you the big one to give you an example of what these things are. And halachically, the small ones are just as awesome.
That's exactly it. But the person who's listening doesn't necessarily agree to. You made a decision that even the small ones are awesome. That he might not agree to. So that's what's not being so straight about that. But what was more, and again to what we're talking about, is Rebelsky said like this. He said, guys, you're telling me that it's matzui. You came with all mathematical calculations that it's matzui. I told you this idea before. He said, there's millions of people living in New York. And there have been, for 100 years, there have been millions of people living here, and they're all drinking the same water. How can you say that it's matzui when nobody can see it? You say matzui. It happens all the time. He says, where's this logic to say that this thing is matzui? He's being makel. Usually Rebelsky's way of looking at it is a chumrah. In this case, it's a kula. He says, how can you say, based on numbers, you made your calculations of percentages, therefore it's usher. Therefore it's matzui. He says, matzui? He says, no one can see it. All these people are drinking water.
It sounds like you're confusing whether matzui, not matzui, whether the whole shayla question if the bug this size is mutter or not.
Okay, you're right that if we throw in the question of size, we'll maybe be miyash of the question. He won't have such a question on them, but
he'll grab you by his gospel. Just say it's mutter. That's all.
It's two different questions. Okay, two different questions. You're right. You can. One is to say is what you're looking at. You're making your numbers based on a certain size, and I disagree about that size. And the male, even you should agree that it's not matzui. But he's saying, forget about the detail of it. He says, notice you're looking at the trees. He says, look at the forest. He says, look at the big picture. You want to claim to me that this thing is matzui. If it would be matzui, how could no one ever saw it until you guys woke up? Even after you saw it, most people can't find it. So, in other words, you're talking about the detail. The reason why you're making a mistake in your calculations is I have an explanation why I make a mistake. But he's saying the whole musag is we're saying it's matzui. Well, it can't be matzui if no one ever saw it. That's all. Okay. Just to wind down, I have to mention 3-4 things about when you make the cheshbon of something being Miut Hamatsui. As I've already said, you get the hang of it is that when you're trying to count whether something is matzui or not matzui, what we talked about in Halacha Ches about how big a bug has to be usher plays a very critical role. Because if I think that this size bug is usher and you think that size bug is mutter, then I may come to a different understanding of whether it's matzui or not matzui. Okay, we're looking at, we don't have the same set of rules. So the first thing we have to decide if it's matzui is, well, which bugs are the ones that count towards being asur or mutter? How can I say if it's matzui if we haven't yet first decided what is or is not a bug? And in fact, there was a project a bunch of hashkachos were going to work on, they got caught on exactly that. They were trying to work on a project they're working on matzui, and they got stuck right on that spot, which is, well, how are we going to, they couldn't come to terms or to an agreement as to what was or was not what was the size that was us. So how could we make statistics if we don't agree what we're looking at? Okay.
So tell me which hashkacha said that not every bug is us.
We'll wait for the tape to go. Okay, the second thing is, in order to make this determination whether it's matzui or not, you have to use people, this is sort of what David said before, who know what they're looking at. I once visited a company, somebody gives hashkacha on a vegetable that is assumed to be infested, and I said to him, what do you do about the bugs in this vegetable? He said, I looked, I don't see any bugs. We don't have any bugs here. So I said to the person, if you don't see any bugs in here, but the whole world thinks that there are bugs in that vegetable, whatever the vegetable was, I said, did you ever go with your vegetable to someone who knows where the bugs are to show them to you? Because you can't judge whether it's matzui or not. If you never find it and everyone else thinks it is, either they're all crazy or you're missing something. So you have to be able to, I don't want to say, humble yourself to go to somebody else and say, show me where the bugs are, because I must be missing something. Okay, so the second thing is the guy who's looking has to be able to know what he's looking at. And if he never saw the bug in that vegetable, then he's not the right person. Okay. Also is, when we judge whether something is matzui or not, foods go through different stages. For example, celery, well, at least certain places when you buy celery, there are bugs all over the place. Okay, there's bugs on every stalk's got a bug on it. So if you look at celery as it comes out of the ground, it is matzui. Or maybe it's even worse than matzui. But if you wash it, then there's very few bugs on it. It's very easy to clean them off. So washed celery and unwashed celery are not really the same thing. So when we make our judgment of whether something is matzui or not matzui, you can't just lump everything together. There's different, it goes through different stages. This might be yes matzui or not matzui in the same food. The same food might have that. And lastly is that it's not only the same food, but there's lots of other factors that decide whether something's going to be infested. And those are also, so when we break down food, is it matzui or is it not matzui, we have to think about those also. For example, if you grow broccoli in California in the summer, you're going to have bugs in it. Okay? My judgment. You're going to have bugs in it. If you grow broccoli in the cold mountains of Guatemala, you're not going to have bugs in it. They don't bugs for whatever. That's just the way they grow. In that climate, in that situation, they don't get bugs in them. So you can't even just say I'm taking broccoli that was not washed and it is matzui, it's not matzui. There are other factors, like as in where it grows and how rainy the season is, or the location. There are other parts to making a determination. Yes, it's matzui, no, it's not. And deciding that these other things come into play also in making that, because it's really not the same thing. This vegetable and that vegetable, they look the same, but they're not really the same.